Hey everybody. We're really excited to have Alex here. Alex, I think I first got to know you through ODF. We've, gotten to see you go on quite a journey. But I think that we'll probably talk about sort of the pre-ODF days and sort of what you're working on now and sort of what that process has been like for you, exploring various ideas, applying yourself in your interests. I think that maybe we could start off. I know that you dropped out of college to pursue one of your ideas, and maybe we should start there. What was that? What was that time like? What were you thinking about then? And we can kind of go through the journey to you working on Mentava today.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thanks for that intro. I think when we met, that was when I had just dropped out of college and I was working on this nutrition startup. And if you told me that I'd be working on a nutrition startup a few years ago, I'd be like, you're out of your mind because it's just never something I would have expected myself doing because I've always done education my entire life. But this was when I was in college, and I realized that the cafeteria food and just students' overall diets were terrible. And there was not really a good alternative because the only access that you have is the school cafeteria. So I thought, what is the best way to sort of eat a healthy lifestyle in this environment? I myself had gained like I think 10 pounds in the first semester, which was like crazy. The startup essentially started as an analysis of that question: how does a student maintain a healthy diet? And a conclusion after looking at dozens of cafeteria menus was that it's not actually statistically possible to maintain a healthy diet in college cafeterias. At the time, we had built out a sort of analyzer, or the better description would be a menu setter for cafeterias. And we wanted to sell it to schools so that they can essentially ensure that they're not just feeding fried chicken every single meal, which was what my university was doing. But yeah, I think at that time I was looking into the raising process, and I think we were like midway through the discovery process with cafeterias, where what essentially ended up happening with that startup was we realized way too late that we built something that was needed but cafeterias didn't want. There's a big problem if the main customers you're trying to sell to aren't interested in what you're selling.
There's also this challenge, right, where sometimes we see startups have this happen where you're building for one group of people, but the person who's ultimately making the decision about paying for it or installing it or even giving you access to that group of people, they might not actually want it or care. So even if the end user would be really excited about it, they might not actually be the ones who could ultimately make the decision. That could be really tough. What did you decide to do when that happened?
Well, when we finally made the sort of big realization of, oh, like schools would never be sort of interested in this type of thing, I just decided to shut down. But before I accepted that, there was a period of denial where I was saying, okay, let's pivot to a consumer product where, it's fine if cafeterias won't work with us, but we can at least help students balance their nutrition the best that they can. And so we completely pivoted to an app where it essentially took the nutritional information of the cafeteria foods and balanced, essentially told you which foods to take for whatever your nutritional needs are. We also that also came to an end because we also realized that students just don't really care about their nutrition that much. At least not the majority of the students. There were certain students who care, like athletes or people like that. But it is a very very niche audience. And so after we made those two big realizations, it was I just realized that it was probably not the time for this type of product.
maybe really quickly you could sort of juxtapose that experience with the work that you were doing for education prior to that. Talk to us about sort of what you were doing back then, what that actually looked like, how that got started, and then maybe we can talk about sort of the juxtaposition between the education work, the health plan, sort of health guidance, and then that will actually lead to us talking about what you're doing today at Mentava.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think one of the big sort of themes or takeaways from my entire like experience with nutrition is before I worked in nonprofit education, where it's an environment where even without going into the specifics, it's an environment where really all you have to do is give people what they need, and you don't really have to care about anything else as long as you're doing as long as you're solving a problem for them, because you're doing it for free. It doesn't matter how much friction there is, it doesn't matter how well you're marketing it. Like, people will, all you have to do is reach out to someone, give it to them, and that's it. Like, it's compared to, an actual most businesses or, products where you have to be able to convince people that they want the thing that you think they need, which is much harder. My original sort of foray into education was by starting this nonprofit that I ran for 5 years. It's called Education for All Foundation. And what we did was we worked with rural schools across China and essentially acted as English teachers for them, because most of these schools were completely underfunded, completely mismanaged, and the teachers were not qualified to teach a lot of the subjects. And one of them was English. Most teachers there, so the only requirement to teach at a rural elementary school in China is that you have to have any bachelor's degree. Doesn't have to be in English. Yeah. So most of the teachers just did not know how to speak English, which is a problem. So this was back in 2018, where I firsthand visited one of these villages and realized that, hey, I'm someone who can speak English. Let me try teaching. And so that was how the organization really started. Yeah, I didn't really, at the beginning, it wasn't really even oh, let's start an organization. It was just this is something that I can do to make a difference and to provide value. Let me just continue doing that. And so for the first year, all the organization was is just me and a few other volunteers, like, teaching one class of 20 students through Zoom throughout the school year. Eventually we realized, through many trial and errors, that like many other schools needed this and many other students from North America can be doing this. In a very oversimplified way, that's how we decided to start expanding.
I'd be curious to hear how old you were when you started this, because at this point, I assume you hadn't been to business school. The concept of contributing value to society probably hadn't been drilled into your head at that point. Sort of like what popped into your head that made you think, you know what, like I need to solve this. I need to contribute to solving the solution. Were people sort of asking you to teach them? Were your parents working in nonprofits in the past? Sort of what do you think it was that spurred this?
Yeah. Well, at the time I was, I think, 14. It was the summer after grade 9. It was like what sparked the initial realization was just firsthand visiting one of these villages. From like basically my entire life, I grew up in Canada, which is already a bubble, but I also went to a very, let's say, preppy private school where a lot of it was just like the students that I was surrounded with were just extremely academically focused and, well off financially. That is a very significant bubble of just of the portion of the world that you're interacting with. And so firsthand visiting these villages made me realize there's an entire different sort of, world that people are living in. And the realization that made me think, oh, I need to be helping, is that I realized that people who grow up in this situation have no agency. And that is, I think, core to us being builders, a big, you know, that is what enables us to do what we want to do. Otherwise, I think even if you get, Elon Musk to grow up in one of these villages, like, I don't think I think he'll stay in those village in that village for his entire life. It's just a case where if you grow up in that environment, very little matters of what you actually do, of the choices that you make. And so that was when I realized that English can be one of the things that helps a lot. That was just an assumption in the beginning of, if they can speak fluent English, then at least they can do a translator job or something like that. At least it's a hard skill that very few people in China have. I think the statistic is only 1.3% of people in China can speak fluent English, which is terrible, considering the fact that I think around 30% of the population has been educated in English. So that's the retention rate for you. Yeah, the what essentially happened was, it wasn't like a light bulb moment. It was more of as I taught these classes week by week, as we were planning them, as I was working with these other students, I realized that, number one, I could do a lot despite never having any formal teaching experience. I didn't even tutor someone before that point. I had I think I still have a not super like accurate English accent. People say I pronounce my R's pretty poorly. But despite all of this, I was able to teach these classes much more effectively than basically any other option that they had. And many other students in North America, as long as you can speak English fluently, they can also do it. And so it was a combination of those realizations that made me think, if I can do this and I'm getting so much value and sort of just personal enjoyment from teaching this, and I am contributing to society, then this should be something that anyone who speaks English should be able to do this. Yeah, that's when at that summer after, in 2019, I decided to really push on, let's expand and let's get more volunteers and more schools. At the beginning of 2019, I think we had seven volunteers, including me, and one school with one class. And then by the end of 2019, we had 3 schools and around 120 students and around 20 or 30 so volunteers who were teaching. And then that growth continued until I graduated high school. By the end of high school, we had around 1,500 students in around 20 or so schools. One of the things that we were constantly doing was, we wanted to constantly examine and sort of challenge our sort of beliefs about what we were doing. I think this is a trap that a lot of nonprofits in particular fall into, where it's astonishing why nonprofits aren't run the same way that startups are, at least student nonprofits. A lot of nonprofits, frankly, are just, at least student-run nonprofits, again, I want to be very specific in this, they're sort of just done to be put on the resume and, for the college apps. I did not want to do it like that. We were constantly examining exactly were we actually making impact? Were our volunteers motivated just for service hours, or were they motivated to actually did they actually care? That was our number one sort of criteria for whether you were admitted as a volunteer or not. Because of that sort of examination, we also did a lot of other operations. So we also started a art program, because art is just, we think it's a great outlet for them. And after that, we found that by including art, kids were just in general much more motivated to go to school for the other subjects as well. We also did a mentorship program, a one-on-one sort of big brother, big sister program. I would call it a mixture between it's a very informal way of doing therapy plus having a sort of life coach. And we essentially got a licensed therapist to train these volunteers to do these conversations. And we did them in particular with left behind children. So this was one of our biggest group that we were targeting, the formal definition of a left behind child is essentially someone who's lost one or both of their parents. And this can be either to divorce or some other reason. We found that these kids were the most sort of in need. And so they were the people who we targeted. We also gave a lot of scholarships to them and to the schools as well. One of the things we realized through this is the funding in rural areas for schools is just, it's an unmitigated disaster. There was one summer where one of our schools got completely flooded, and the local government didn't give a single cent to them to help them rebuild. So the cost of rebuilding had to come from, number one, teachers' salaries, and number two, like us. So we gave, I think, at least $10,000 to that school to help them rebuild. But all of these experiences essentially left me realizing that, at the beginning of this, I didn't know how to do anything, frankly. I didn't even know what the word entrepreneurship meant. I didn't know what I was doing could be defined as that. But at the end of it, I realized that, just a group of students who, frankly, would, most of the time we were just in over our heads of what we thought we could do. We could work together to do something that truly made a difference, and not just made a difference in the, oh, I saved you like a few minutes of time per day sort of way, but in a way that I think we did truly change some people's lives. I think that realization is what gave me the confidence for basically everything else I've done up to this point. And hopefully it gave a lot of our volunteers that confidence as well. Because I think that realization of, oh, like my efforts can translate into something that meaningful. I think that realization is something that very few students ever get to realize.
There's something really interesting about the story of you building this nonprofit and scaling it to a really significant degree, which is that you didn't start out with the goal of having something that scales to a very significant degree. You started out by observing something that was kind of troubling to you, something that you felt like you could actually do something about on an individual level. And you started out on that individual level, and then you scaled it up. And it seems like you scaled it up kind of slowly to start. It wasn't like you went from it's just me to, okay, now I want to have thousands of students that I'm, supporting. You kind of slowly scaled it at the beginning, and then at some point you realized, okay, this is something that I really want to put more energy into. I want to make bigger. It's really cool to hear that, because I think that oftentimes when people see something that's big, they kind of assume that it started out with like these really big ambitions. But it doesn't always happen that way. It can sometimes just start from something that's quite small, and that's even just at an individual basis. So I think it's useful for people to hear that.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think one of the barriers or hindrances of having a super big ambition, especially at the beginning, is you most likely won't see results for a very long time, at least not the results that you envision. And so I think having that, and I've also fallen into this trap a lot as well, in terms of just it takes time for those results to show. And not just time in terms of waiting for it to happen, but time in terms of you're working every single day, and maybe like every single day you're seeing minimal progress. So I think starting from a very grounded place helped us get through the more sort of, I don't want to call them difficult times, because we did enjoy a lot of that process, but it helped us get through a lot of times that we maybe weren't achieving our sort of explicit goals. Yeah, like eventually we just found the right solutions to the problems that we had, but again, it just takes time.
I was just on a call interviewing somebody for ODF, and they weren't living in the United States. They were living abroad in Europe. And they said, I really want to figure out what I want to do with the next 7 years of my life. What do I want to dedicate the next 7 years of my life to? And by my estimate, it sounds like you worked for about 5 years on this project, right? You probably didn't think that you were going to dedicate 5 years of your life to it when you started, right? but you ended up finding something that you ended up dedicating a lot of time to, and it seems like it was time well spent. So I'm curious how you think about that. It seems like there are some people who, they go that route of they really sort of find the thing that they want to work on, and they know that it's the thing they want to spend the next 5 years on, and then they go and spend the next 5, 7 years on it. And there are other people who maybe they just start working on something one day and it kind of becomes the thing that they just really enjoy. And then 5 years happen and they're like, wow, what a ride. Like, this was amazing. But they didn't necessarily consciously think when they got started, like, I'm looking for a thing that I'm going to spend 7 years on. How did you think about that? Or how do you think about that now in hindsight? And what advice would you give for people who are kind of mulling that over?
It's definitely, hindsight is 2020. I think at the beginning, it was just a let me try doing this and see how it goes type of deal. It was I was being intentional with it in terms of I want to do it the best that I can, but it definitely wasn't a I had this master plan of like how I would like do everything. I think the way that I would have approached it, knowing what I know now, is I think that I was very lucky, first of all, finding something that I could sort of that suited my strengths, or at least I was motivated to develop my strengths within. I think a lot of that comes with just trying a lot of things and eventually getting an intuitive sense of something that resonates. But I think that it's difficult to be more like for every single person. I think it's very difficult to be more sort of precise and to say, oh, like from the very beginning, oh, this will be something I am interested in. I think really the best that you could do is just try different things, and once you find something that just you feel like can be something more, to just start pursuing it. And if you want to be efficient about it, then keeping an eye on for signs of whether it is suiting you or not. But I think it's very, people talk a lot about, oh, like how do I find my passion, it's sort of like a treasure map, and it's really really not like that. There's never a sort of like one moment where it all clicks. It's much more of a journey in my perspective. And for my nutrition startup, it was that way as well, where it initially it started as a school project, ironically, and eventually, in the middle of it, I realized it could be something more. But then slowly, I realized that it wasn't going to work out, and yeah, I think that's just at least the way that I approach these types of motivators.
It feels a lot like sometimes people think that they need to figure out the thing that they're going to spend 7 years on before they start doing any sort of work at all, of trying things, and then they never actually get a chance to find the thing, because the way you find the thing is by trying things.
Exactly.
Maybe this is a good pivot though to Mentava, because you found this thing with your education nonprofit. You scaled it to a significant degree. You realized it was something that was really meaningful to you, and you found sort of the 5 years of work. You sort of moved on to work on this nutrition company idea that kind of came out of a school project. So maybe it wasn't the one that you really wanted to spend the next 5, 7 years on, after you kind of did the little exploration. That's kind of what ODF is for, right? So it was cool that you joined ODF to do that, and then ultimately you landed at Mentava. What was that like?
Yeah, well, first of all, I gotta shout out you again for connecting me to Mentava in the first place. I guess like a little story time is like basically this was not even like I think a main part of our conversation. I think it was just in the beginning you just mentioned Mentava offhand as something I should look into when I was talking to you about the nutrition startup. The sort of story, I guess, of how I joined Mentava is this was this was I think mid 2022 when you told me about Mentava, and I reached out to Neil, as the founder, right afterwards on Twitter, and we had this really great conversation where I told him about myself, I thought he told me about what he was working on. By then, he had already raised a round or a seed round. We basically ended off the convo with like, let's definitely, like, because I was still working on the startup. So he didn't say like, oh, like drop your thing and join me now. But I think we were very mission aligned from the very beginning, and like that conversation of whether I want to help build Mentava was definitely like on the table. So basically, like fast forward a couple months, I realized my nutrition stuff is not going to work out. Basically, the day after that, I reached out to Niels again, saying like, "Hey, schedule's open," and we get on another call, and we basically like decide to work together, and that was in August of 2022. So since then, it's been almost 2 years of working at Mentava. I think one of the biggest things, it's sort of interesting because the dichotomy between working on something by yourself and building something yourself versus building it in a sort of full-time, very high impact team is something that it took me a bit of time to get used to. And the reason why I say by myself for my for Education for All is just because it was a completely different dynamic of, again, like a nonprofit environment, working with other students. And for other students, like your top priority is always going to be your schoolwork. And so building EFA came as a secondary thing. But the biggest thing from Mentava is that I realized every single person in the team is completely sort of self-sufficient. I think everyone in the team can go out and just build stuff on their own and be like very successful. And just being able to coordinate that, even in a small team like ours, we only have 5 people now still, including Niels, and even being able to coordinate that has been a pretty delightful challenge. But I think the biggest takeaway from me over these past 2 years in terms of sort of what to expect is just I think the biggest thing to work on if you're sort of not at that stage yet is just working on your own, not even like I wouldn't even say your own projects or like the goal. I would say the reason why you would work on your own projects is so that you can work on yourself. Mentava is an environment where it's very much like it really doesn't matter what your sort of quote unquote like explicit role is. If you're an engineer and if you have a great idea about product, great, we're going to implement it. If I'm the product manager there. If I have a great idea about the sign up flow or about or art style, we're going to implement it. So it's very much a case of it really doesn't matter what you've done in the past or anything like that. It really matters about how you think and how you contribute. That is something that I think you can really only hone through, at least if you're a student, through doing projects yourself, through using these projects as avenues to build your own skill set.
Something that I just find super interesting about you as a whole is sort of how you think about how people think. Obviously, you took kind of like an unconventional path with your own personal education. Then, sort of all throughout that education through elementary and high school, you're working on this education nonprofit. Now you're working at this education startup, which we can get into a little bit if you like. But they have very specific ideas on how people should be, thinking and education as a whole. What are sort of some of the core pillars of your ideology on education after sort of having this firsthand experience of doing things a little bit differently yourself, helping others learn, halfway across the globe, and now working at this education startup?
That's a great question. I think on a personal note, the thing that I still is very close and near and dear to my heart and is sort of the foundation of why I started my nonprofit and why I believe in education as a whole is just its ability to affect individuals and their life paths. And that sounds like a very general thing, but I do generally believe that like many things, almost everything is downstream from education. And I mean education not in the sense of just what you're doing in school, but also, how your parents are raising you, what experiences you're being exposed to from a very young age, what community you're growing up in. Just it is a very when I put it like that, it's more abstract, but really it's a case of the analogy I always use in my head is the difference between a good education and a poor education is like the difference between having agency in your life versus not. And that feeling of like helplessness is something that I think is a deep injustice. So I guess the way, talking a bit about how that relates to Mentava, something that we really believe in is just giving that personal agency to parents and to kids. One of the biggest problems right now, not even like saying rural areas, but in developed countries, is the the way that our school system is set up is in a way where parents and students have very little agency over what education they're getting. And really, there are not many good options out there for teaching yourself. Obviously, there are a lot of supplementary classes, there's Khan Academy, there's a lot of things like that. But we find that a lot of these options are either unaffordable, or they're not effective enough, or most of them actually suffer from the problem of they are not optimized for learning, they are optimized for engagement. And the thing that they care most about is either getting you to go back to their app day after day, or getting you to sign up for more and more courses. And this is, I guess, diving into the weeds of like the education industry, but the interesting thing about it, I think, like Julian mentioned with the nutritionist startup, is the people who you're selling to are different from the people who you're trying to help, and who the product is for. And so the dynamics between that is causes to put it bluntly, it causes a lot of inefficiency, and at times going in the wrong direction of what you're trying to teach. And so what we're trying to do is essentially give students and parents that agency back, especially for families that care explicitly about learning. And that is also a very niche market, surprisingly. But most parents and most families, really, the reason why they sign their kids up for supplemental classes, or they send their kids to school, isn't for learning, but for babysitting. It's just so that they have a place where the kids can go for a few hours of for the school day, while being sure that they're not going off and causing trouble when they are learning the quote unquote sort of core skills needed. But really, like, if you ask most parents like are not in the position where they really care, oh, like, I want my kids to get ahead and sort of do that. As long as your kid is doing okay, that's what most parents care about.
So I feel like I'm sort of hearing these overarching kind of themes of wanting to put agency back in the hands of people just getting started, sort of fighting against and trying to figure out misaligned incentives. Do you believe that there's any world where public education reaches a point that is maybe more aligned and more in tune with what you guys are trying to build at Mentava?
I think it will take a lot of time. it I think it's less of a question of how good schools get, or how good education gets, and it's more of a question of what does our culture value. And in point, you can also argue that it's a chicken and egg problem of as long as schools get better, then parents and families will also realize that schools can be better. In a lot of ways, right now we are trying to essentially prove that hypothesis of your kids can be doing better than they are in school, and they can be doing better by just either learning by themselves, or spending less time in school. And I know, or you have first-hand experience with that, having homeschool yourself. But it's a surprisingly few number of people who actually know that like, the way that schools are doing things are not the most efficient, just by doing things yourself, you can probably get much better outcomes. And this isn't to say that this is the fault of like schools in particular or teachers or parents or anything. I think it is a result of how the school system has been set up, as well as misaligned policymakers who just aren't really in touch with what people really need or what families really want. I think, a few recent examples are, I think Seattle just cut the entire gifted program, and another one city to add another city to the big list of cities that already done that. California recently, I think they recently actually lifted this ban. For a long time, but for a long time they banned teaching algebra before ninth grade. And I think the reasoning for that was just because they saw that, oh, kids were doing poorly in algebra like beforehand, so they banned everyone from doing it. Which, yeah, I mean, you can draw your own conclusions of why that probably isn't the best solution.
Something incredible about what you do, and sort of the through line on a lot of the things you've done, at least on the education side of things, which is like, I think that you spend a lot of time thinking about how can we raise the floor, with especially with your nonprofit, which is so important. Which is like, how do we actually just like give more people great opportunities, and then how do we also, and I think you're doing this a lot with Mentava, how do we just also assume that there is no ceiling, right? There is no ceiling to what somebody's capable of at a certain age. To assume there's no ceiling about what somebody's capable of regardless of where they came from, right? What country, what town they were born in, and that combination of like no floor and or raise the floor and no ceilings. It's just a really powerful one because it says how can we actually like lift people up so that people just have generally more options and more opportunities available to them, and then how do we not constrain people from kind of accomplishing what their potential is. It's you think about getting rid of algebra or getting rid of programs that encourage people to push themselves, and you look at what you're doing with Mentava and sort of saying, hey, there is no ceiling to what you're capable of, and I think it's a really powerful combo.
I love that analogy of the floor and the ceiling. I think it's definitely like two ends or two sides of the same problem. Where, yeah, with EFA, with Education for All, one of our metrics, I guess you can say, that we were constantly using is how did our students compare to students who grew up in urban areas, because that is sort of the divide that we were trying to bridge. Where it's something, I think the statistic is like something like 95% of urban students go to university, while only like 17% from rural areas go to university. So there's a lot of statistics like that show that divide, and that was also something we're trying to gap, and we actually did manage to, at least for English, we did manage to close that, where our students were on par and sometimes even ahead of the urban level. But I say that, but it's not a huge achievement because, like, remember, even the urban areas, like the retention rate is like 3% for English education. So the urban areas education isn't, at least for English education, it already isn't amazing. But yeah, for Mentava, that is really like, I guess you can say one of our end goals is really trying to raise that ceiling, raise that bar of like, what can students really achieve. I remember, again, like in the environment I grew up, where it was already like super competitive. People really cared about school, really cared about academics. And in that environment, I think the most sort of advanced kids would, they were doing calculus, let's say in like 9th or 10th grade, but there was only like, out of an entire school district, it was only like 3 or 4 students every year that could do that out of, thousands or tens of thousands of students. We think that number can be much, much higher. And, because for those students, the only reason they were able to do that is because they or their parents pushed super hard for the school to really allow them to do that. Because most schools, they really only let you go like maybe 1-2 years ahead of the school curriculum. That actually happened with me, where, for example, I self-studied AP Physics 1, when I was in 10th grade, and they still made me take the entire course the next year after I got a 5 in the AP exam, which is yeah, I mean, it's sort of like that is just one course, but a lot of other courses also happened with that for me, and for a lot of other students as well. So it's a case of just a lot of bureaucracy in the school system prevents students who can be achieving more to really achieve more. Versus, when I started talking to homeschoolers, using Ari as an example, he spends like 2 hours on academics a day, and he gets like everything done, compared to my school that took 8 or 9 hours, plus not including homework. I also met another homeschooler who he had completed his master's degree. He had completed like half of his master's degree courses by the time he graduated high school, which is also just like ridiculous. But I mean, that is like sort of what you can really do if you start homeschooling from a young age, and just letting kids learn at their own pace. And that's really what we're also trying to do for students who don't necessarily want to take the plunge into homeschooling, but still want to sort of get ahead. And because homeschooling takes a lot of effort. I think Ari can also attest to this, not just from the student, but from the parent as well. So we're really trying to make the benefits of homeschooling, at least when done correctly, available to a lot more people.
Well, Alex, this has been amazing. I think that the last takeaway that I would have off of all of that is, there's really something to be said about when you remove barriers for people to make progress at their own pace, and then encourage them and actually support them in making progress faster than maybe is typically expected. You'll be surprised by just how much people can accomplish and over what period of time, and just how many people are capable of that. Many more than I think maybe the typical school system, or maybe just the average person thinks that people are capable of accomplishing. So I think that could be applied to so many other areas other than just elementary school education or preschool education. It could be applied to what people can do with their side projects. It could be applied to what people do with their startups or at their jobs. It's just a really great note to leave on. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today, and really exciting to see what the future holds for Mentava.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for having me. And yeah, thanks for letting me go on about these things that I care a lot about.